Okay, so once again, I want to talk about sex and gender. I made a video on this subject a few months ago now. This video is going to kind of build on that, really. And it's kind of this subject has remained current on YouTube in the intervening time. I suppose more than anything through the efforts of Lacey Green, who only last week made a hangout and another video on this particular subject. And so my thoughts is kind of progressing on this. So what I want to talk about is revisit a couple of wells, revisit the well of biological sex, revisit the well of gender, but then also talk about in between some criticisms that I have of the standard model of sex and gender in feminist theory and how I think that impacts upon the discussions that you can have, hamstrings the discussions that you can have. So some criticisms to be made there. So let's start off with biological sex as I did in the original video, and I'll link you to the original video. It's worth watching that one as well. If not least just for my little bit at the end where I show that if we applied the same rationale to races as we did to non-binary genders, this is the kind of stuff that we'd come out with. But we'll start off with biological sex. And the point that I'd made in the previous video was that people seem to be working as if biological sex is defined by having a penis or a vagina, is defined by having XY chromosomes or XX chromosomes, when that is not the case. A penis is just a delivery method, and the XY-XX system is just the system that functions in mammals. It's not the case across the animal kingdom. And of course it is true that if we found another species of ape whereby some of the individuals produced eggs but had a penis, right? Well, we wouldn't define that as a male ape, we define that as a female ape because it produces eggs. It's all about the gametes. It's not about whether or not you've got a penis. If we found that the individuals who had XY chromosomes were producing eggs, we wouldn't define that as a male egg layer. No, we define it as female because it's all about the gametes. And that was the point that I made in the first video. And of course, most people, right, produce sperm or eggs or have the machinery to do so. And that includes the vast majority of intersex conditions as well. They can either produce gametes, sperm or eggs, or they have the machinery, the internal machinery, unambiguously to produce one or the other. That machinery may not work, but in the same way, a car is there for getting you from A to B. If your car breaks down, it's still a fucking car. We can still realise that it's just a car that is dysfunctional, that does not work properly. And that was about as far as I got on the previous video, at least with regard to biological sex. Admittedly, with it being me, it took me about 20 minutes, I think, to make that argument. But that was about as far as I got. Since then, I've been doing some more thinking on this subject, as I say, because it's been current on YouTube. Largely thinking about this drive, this motivation. What is motivating some people to say that two biological sexes aren't enough? That it's not describing everybody, and that we need to have a third biological sex because, look, there are some people that aren't described by this. Now, they usually point, as I mentioned earlier, to intersex people, but most intersex people, despite having the intersex condition, still unambiguously, if you examine them internally, have the structures that make them unambiguously male or female. It's only very, very few people that we can't discern between the two. But the argument goes, I think, that if there are people that don't fit into the system, then the system needs to expand to take account of them. And that is the argument that's driving this argument of a third biological sex. But why does it? The system is not there to describe people. The system is there to describe a process. The terms male and female are there. That is language that helps us furnish our description of the process of sexual reproduction by describing the two roles that are involved in sexual reproduction and to describe the organisms that carry out those two roles. And that's it. That's all that's there for. If we didn't sexually reproduce, we wouldn't have the labels male and female. These two labels that are applied across the animal kingdom rigidly to describe those organisms that produce sperm and those organisms that produce eggs. Those are the labels that we use. And the suggestion that if you don't fit into that system, that the system is wrong, that's the bit that I've got to take exception to. And that includes taking exception to some extent to an article that was published in the esteemed journal Nature a couple of years back that seemed to be making the case that we need to expand the definition of biological sex on account of people that don't fit in. I don't criticise the science in that article, but I criticise the conclusion, because we don't need to expand it because there are no new roles. So effectively they're making the same error I would suggest that people are making here. What is wrong with simply saying if you don't fit into a system, then perhaps that system is not applicable to you? After all, that is the norm with almost every labelling system we have. I used to play cricket back in the day, and in cricket there are 3 roles: batting, bowling and wicket keeping, and they describe the 3 skills that are involved in the game and the individuals, batsmen, bowlers and wicket keepers, that perform those skills. I was a bowler. If you've never played cricket and I ask you which one are you, a batsman, a bowler or a wicket keeper, what are you going to answer? Well, none of them, because you're none of those things because you've never played cricket. It's not applicable to you. Is the answer to that question, whoa, the world of cricket's got its labelling wrong, it's not accounting for everybody? Of course not. We can all immediately see, because we don't have any emotional investment in this question, that effectively what we have here is a system of labels that is not intended to account for people that have never played cricket. Similarly, if you didn't possess any internal or external sexual organs whatsoever, let us say, then the system of sexual reproduction is not there to give you a label. What is wrong in that instance with simply saying, well, this system is not applicable to you? It's not the case that we need to alter the system to make sure that you're furnished with a label under this system. Perhaps the most sensible approach, I would suggest, is just to say that in those instances where it truly is ambiguous, the answer is to say not applicable. Not to try and create a third role where clearly in terms of the process there is no third role. That's a bit that I wanted to add on with regard to biological sex. But before I move on to the subject of gender, there's a little conversation that I want to have. I say it's a conversation, it's a monologue really. You can talk back all you like, I can't fucking hear you. A little monologue I want to give on the language that we're using with regards to biological sex and gender. I think that I'm using them in a way that allows all bases to be covered, but I think that a lot of people, particularly in feminist theory, this standard model of sex and gender defines the terms in such a way that I'm suggesting there's a chasm in between of things that we're not even capable of discussing using the language. And if you want to rule an idea out, you should rule the idea out based on evidence and reasoning, not based on the judicious, and I'm saying that in a cynical way, the judicious way that you've created the labels. In that system, the labels are such that biological sex is effectively everything that happens from the neck down. Sure, it's the gametes you produce, it's also the primary and secondary sexual characteristics as manifested physically in your body. Gender is defined as a social construct. It's all the cultural learning and understanding that takes place. That effectively the way that males and females behave, the differences between them, is all as a result of learnt behaviour. I'm sure you can see the issue here. We've got biological sex here, which is all the physical body related stuff. We've got the gender related stuff, which is all the mental stuff, which is learnt behaviour. What about stuff which is cognitive stuff, which is mental stuff, but which is innate? Maybe you don't believe. Maybe you're one of these people that you are a genuine blank slatist, or you're not a blank slatist, but you don't think that the business of biological sex in any way affects cognitive functions in terms of embryological development, adolescent development, the process of puberty. You don't believe there's any effects whatsoever. Even if you don't, to choose language that then rules that out of the debate on the grounds of the language that you've chosen is not a good thing to do. And yet this is the problem. You can have a discussion with sex and gender with some people, but their definition of gender means that anything which is intrinsic to the individual doesn't class as gender. So if we're talking about something, for example, people being potentially born with an understanding that they are male or female, and if they have ambiguous external genitalia and they get assigned the wrong biological sex with regard to it, and they get brought up being told that they are a girl or they are a boy, and they feel totally different, how does that fit into this scope? The mental processes aren't fitting into that definition of biological sex, and they aren't fitting into this definition of gender. In fact, society is trying to gender them in one direction, and they're rebelling against it. Where does it fit into that discussion? I prefer to invoke gender, a description of gender. That, of course, it includes all those cultural factors. And of course, it includes those things that you could regard as social constructs, but it also includes every single potential that people could have for innate gender-related characteristics as well. Let us not use systems of language that stop us having conversations on the backs of those systems of language. If we're going to rule something out of a conversation, that needs to be done through argumentation, not through political language use. And finally, to move on to this business of gender, I suppose you should say gender identity or gender expression in this particular case. And in the previous video, I'd made the argument that this proliferation of non-gender binary identities with lists that go into the 30s, 40s and 50s in some cases is portrayed as a sign that we're finally taking this subject seriously. I said the exact opposite, that actually it's in need of some taxonomic pruning. Taxonomic pruning is evidence that we're taking things seriously. If this was something that we were really taking seriously, there would not be 50 different terms. For every slight little differentiation, we try and put some rhyme and reason into this. But I still went along, kind of passively went along, unthinkingly went along with this idea that effectively man and woman, because I'm on board with the idea that your gender identity is as part of a spectrum, right? And it can be part of a spectrum because our thinking on nearly everything is part of a spectrum. It's not tied into the definition of sexual reproduction, where you can either produce sperm and eggs. You can't produce spegs or right? It's a very much a binary thing. Our brains aren't tied in, aren't hemmed in that same way. And I'm happy that it's a spectrum, but I still went into this. And I suppose if I was to kind of represent it on a scale on the screen where man and woman are just 2 points at the end of the spectrum, and yet we've got this spectrum in between, and that's where all these non-gender binary identities. But the more I've thought about this over the last few weeks, the more I've realised what an absolute crock of shit this portrayal is. It's not that there's no such thing as a non-gender binary identity. It's not that. It's this idea that effectively man or woman are these discrete identities that are just like very narrow and focused. And that's absolutely not the case at all. If you're a man, think about all the men you know. If you're a woman, think about all the women you know. And how different they are in how they express their masculinity, their femininity, in how they express being a man or being a woman. Think about the people that you've seen on the television, the weird and wonderful people that adopt the labels man and woman for themselves quite happily. And just what a huge array of different gender expressions that incorporates. And then when you go back to look at that model on screen, you realise that it's absolutely nothing like that whatsoever. And that effectively man occupies a huge range of gender expressions. Woman occupies a huge range of gender expressions. Now, if these two terms, these two singular terms, can cover such a huge gamut of gender identities, why the fuck do we need 50 identities for all the shit that's in between? Right? That is, I think, the distillation of what I was saying in the other video. Once I've thought about how that relates to the terms man and woman, it isn't man and woman at the end and all these 50 things in between. It's man or woman with this tiny little thing. As I've said to a few people online, it's very much like somebody suggesting that we categorize all edibles as food and drink and 50 different types of yogurt, right? That's about as much sense as that system makes. I have no issue with non-gender binary identities, but really, do we need every single individual to come up with something new? I think just non-gender binary, NGB, really should just provide a catch-all for everything. And do we really need to go any further than that? If we do, then I think we need to stop using the terms man and woman, quite honestly, because they're just covering way more ground, it would seem, than all the non-gender binary identities put together. Okay, that's all I wanted to say in this video. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.